going for it? How did you want? I was like, I was like, what the heck?
Yeah.
I will say it took me a little bit longer than Mom just always did it. That's the way it was.
Wait.
I was.
Don't do it, Trina.
Well, Hallie will never be my one.
Yeah, I can. All right, let's, how many of you have seen the movie Conclave?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Okay,
It's about the.
you know Pope Francis died. Do you know what a conclave is?
We saw the two things.
Come on the news, and I saw the movie, and you get a really good idea of what a conclave is.
That was a
how it
stupid
works, the gauntlet and the clustering and all
I
that.
was like, what are you?
And, but I don't know that I could have told you what a conclave was before I saw the movie. It just, you know, 'cause I'm not Catholic and it just kind of goes, you know, by you. But, it gives you kind of, it's fiction. So, but it's probably based, you know, I was talking to Joe earlier, it's probably based on personal accounts of people who are in the know about how this all works. But what is it, 135 cardinals are going to get together at some point? The funeral has taken place. So in the next, what, 15 days or 20 days, they're going to get together for this conclave. And they keep voting. I think they vote once a day until they can agree on who the next pontiff or the next pope is going to be. So I don't know. It's not in the theater anymore. How did we see it?
Netflix.
Netflix? I don't know if
I think
it's.
it's
We paid for
It's
it.
on Amazon as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably where we saw it. So, if you're interested, it'd be worth looking into.
I think it's also a novel.
Well,
Yeah.
you've read
I
it.
didn't know that.
So it's
See, I didn't know that.
you could ask it's based on the novel.
Yeah,
What-
But the novels,
the librarian, he lets us know.
the novels though are better than the pictures.
Stop it.
Sometimes,
So we would.
sometimes.
Well,
The thing about that I learned, and I guess I'm naive, is how political.
no.
It's not what happened in the vote, it's what happened outside the room in the politics.
That's really what
and
the
the news.
movie's about, the discussions and I said posturing, and that's probably a good word, but, however, whatever you want to call it, but, you know, and they're trying to follow God's spirit in the way they can, but you can look back and either objectively or not, and be judgmental on this person's behavior or that person's behavior. They're obviously angling to get what they think is the right thing.
I think what's interesting
We do
is out of
that.
the 138 cardinals, 100 have been appointed by Pope Francis.
Is that right?
And so
That's.
those people may have an edge on the kind of pope they're looking.
Possibly, yeah.
That's not bad.
Because you, Francis, you know, as during his during his leadership, and then during, you know, after he died, he's being portrayed as a pope who's more humanitarian, he's more into reform of the tradition. I mean, this is a long-standing tradition. So the issue is, do we want to continue to reform the tradition, or do we want to step back and embrace the tradition more than maybe it had been? So
Another really good movie that deals with that, like back and forth, is called The Two Popes,
Yeah.
which is about the time between Benedict and Francis. When Benedict steps down and Francis becomes the new pope. It's very good. Again, it is like based on some writings, but it is fictionalized, so.
It's pretty, like, yeah,
Yeah.
no, but I've heard it's pretty.
no, but
From who?
it's
The Pope?
based on,
Because-
well, the difference is, it's based on two actual personalities.
Yes, it
Where
is.
in this movie, I think.
It's completely fictional. Yeah, the conclave is completely fictional.
Also, like, wasn't the first, like the first time there was like two
So
living
let's
popes and
Step
like,
down.
Well,
Really
let's just keep us going and maybe that's something of interest. Let's get back to where we were. We have been working with the English translations of the Bible. So
oh, no, we can't.
what we found is that well, let's keep going. Gotta think about where I want to go with this. What's we've talked about the two main English translations of the Bible. One is a word for word translation and another is a thought for thought translation. So what's a word for word translation?
Direct translation.
You have a handout. You can-
Just taking each word and trying to keep it as close to the actual original word.
A translation that is as close as possible to the grammar and word order of the original languages.
There you go. And Rick, spot on.
I did learn something.
Okay, now what's a thought for thought? That's word for word, thought for thought. Try and word concept. Concept, message, thought, and thought for thought. And so instead of word for word, we're looking at thought for thought. And then when we do a thought for thought translation, we have a little bit more freedom in translating that into everyday English, as opposed to being stuck to the word order, which can be an awkward and choppy translation if you do it in a literal sense. Yes, Anna,
Okay, I have a question.
you have a question?
My
All right.
middle name is Question.
Right.
Now, here in the Matthew, in Matthew, that just what you talked about. Okay.
Where's here? You're on the handout. What page?
What page 2?
Page 2.
Doesn't matter which translation. No, well, it's page 1 or 2, whichever.
It's all for thought page.
Yeah. My question is, through the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, the Holy Spirit, is it Jesus? Or is it? It's not God. Who is the Holy Spirit? Is it Jesus?
Well,
But
you know.
then. They don't mean to answer that.
Yes, yeah.
No, he doesn't, no.
Well, and I'll tell you why I reacted that way. Well, in Protestantism, well, in Christianity overall, there's this notion of the Trinity. So you have
Yeah.
God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. So you have God who created the world, and then God sends his son, however and whoever that may be, Jesus, to this earth, and that's what verse 118 is all about. This is how the birth of Jesus occurred, took place. And then the other aspect of the Trinity is the Holy Spirit. So
So that came down from God. The
most
Holy
likely,
Spirit.
Jesus came down from God, and that's what 1:18-25 is all about in Matthew. But it doesn't really say anything about, it talks about how Jesus came about, doesn't say about the Holy Spirit. If you go back to the Old Testament, we have many references to God's Spirit. It's called Ruach. That's the Hebrew word, so God's Spirit is alive and well. In the New Testament, you never do have, this notion of the Trinity, and then notion of the Trinity, it's somewhat present in the New Testament, but that's not developed till after the New Testament, right? So we have reference to the Holy Spirit, so, you could say it was God, you could say it was God's Spirit, but it was a divine conception, so the conception of Jesus, Mary becoming pregnant, was from the Holy Spirit. And I don't know that we can say much more than that, because then once we go more than that, we get into interpretation and what the difference means. That comes from a Pentecostal tradition, and they believe in the concept of oneness. The Trinity is foreign to them. Oneness is that it's God and the Spirit and Christ, they're all one. Yeah. I'm not saying my theology is far from that. I kind of put them all together in some way, but they'll do a little bit different.
Pat, how does your church reconcile that? Like why they're listed as three different things if they're all the same thing?
Well, I don't want to get into, I mean, there's answers, it would take, a time, but they would reference.
5 or 10 minutes.
I mean, like it also does kind of make sense to me, like that they would be the same thing. So that's why I was curious.
And I think I went to a Baptist college and we just use this word Trinitarian. They were Trinitarian. They believed in the Trinity. And I remember that I missed a question on a test because I answered what I thought they would say. But I think most Trinitarians believe that God is one, that there is one God. But they would reference script, the Pentecostals would reference scriptures. Jesus said, I and my Father are one. And the Holy Spirit who I send in my name. So they would pick out all of these scriptures. I even remember, this was really outrageous, I think. But in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, God said, let us make man. And it was always, well, who's the us? Is there 3 up there, Because that's such simplistic thinking. Is there 3 up there? I hate it when now that I look back, and they say, are you oneness? I had one goofy lady from East Texas come to my house after I had left the church, and she said, are you oneness? I said, one less? One less than what? You mean oneness? But so God said, let us make man, and Brother Norris taught us that he was thinking ahead of Jesus. So that's pretty outrageous.
Yeah, that's a nice convenient way of trying.
Well, and that's just it. They would pick and choose. But I don't think that what I believe and what David believes is any different than what 99% of you believe, and that's kind of what I came to realize. The United Pentecostal oneness people love to parade around and say, we're the only oneness, and you're Trinitarian, and we're oneness, and those are just words. They're just words.
Pat and I've had many discussions, and then at the end, we realized that, yeah, we can talk oneness, we can talk Trinitarian, which is
a bad word.
A bad word in the Pentecostal church, but in the end, you can use all these fancy words and terminology. We're just not all that different. So someone came up, had a recent funeral, and said, I got married, and she said,
asking about you.
Yeah, asking about me. Is he a pastor? Yeah. And does he believe in oneness? Oh, yeah.
Easy answer for that.
Yeah.
Well, because,
Well,
we're not that far. But not oneness in the sense of the Pentecostal. That's much of it. Okay. Hopefully that answers your question. I mean, we're always going to have that question, Anna, what does Christ mean? What does it mean for him to be Christ's son? What does it mean for the Holy Spirit to do something? So then, we kind of work that out in our own way. And we have classes like this where we can talk about it and see what other people.
Well, isn't one of the consensus or guiding thoughts of the Trinity is that it's a mystery? And I
Well, for
don't
me
think
it
we're-
is, yeah.
Yeah, we're
I
not
think
really
so.
supposed to totally grasp it in our
Yeah.
mind.
I think so. Some, there's always gonna be some who wanna make it more black and white and bang, 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 but, when you come down to it, yeah, it is for me a mystery, so. Just leave it there. Say, with my finite mind, I can't figure everything out. In fact, I have more questions than I do answers when it comes to something like this.
The theme at Camp Swatara one year was like the Holy Spirit. And we spent the whole summer talking about it and learning about it from like different Bible teachers, and I still don't quite understand.
That's right.
Well, do any of you remember there was a Holy Spirit conference within the Church of the Brethren? And really that came from the fact, in my estimation, that, the brethren, we've been about doing and, in the, forties, fifties, sixties, you had, M.R. Ziegler and Dan West and, the brethren, we started Heifer Project International. We were part of starting Crop and we were doing all these things. And then some people said, now, wait a minute, we're getting away from a personal relationship with, Christ and the Spirit. So then there was an effort to try to bring that about. And my aunt, she was really big in the Holy Spirit conferences and she went. One time I was living in North Manchester and it was at Manchester College, so I went and sat.
My parents were there.
I sat with her for worship and she was really happy I would come because she knew I wasn't, really invested in it the way she was. But, so you're gonna have, this going on.
So then the question comes up, where does Pentecost come into all of this?
What do you mean by the word Pentecost? Do you mean the day of Pentecost?
Yeah.
Act two, yeah,
Yeah, well, that's what came up in our devotional this
right.
week.
Oh, okay.
He brought up the question. I said, that's a good one for her, Dave.
Well, remember in Luke, and now we're going back to, we're looking at the overall picture. Matthew, Mark, Matthew and Mark definitely, not so much John, have Jesus going from Galilee to Jerusalem. He's making his whole ministry. He's making a movement from Galilee to Jerusalem, and then after he's resurrected, back to Galilee. And Luke doesn't have him go back to Galilee. After he's raised from the dead, Jesus says he doesn't go back to Galilee. He tells the disciples to wait in Jerusalem and wait for what? Yeah, so Acts 2. So that's how Luke answers the question. So they're waiting for the Spirit, and then and not that they may not have had the Spirit before, well, maybe not, according to Luke, but they have it in a more concrete way. They start talking in different languages. So, okay, let's keep moving. So word for word, thought for thought. And now we want to talk about a balance. And the reason we want to talk about,
David, can I ask a question?
you can,
Did the thought for thought, did they have to translate word for word and then come up with what they thought it was? Is that the way?
that's how I do it. I don't think you can do it any other way. You have to, when you're translating, you have to figure out what each word is. And so then, the way I work at it is you take a phrase or a verse, let's say, and you do it word for word. And then within that verse, that might be one thought, or there might be two thoughts in that verse. And so you might take the one or the two thoughts, and then you say, okay, how am I going to translate this in a thought for thought way into English? You have to start word for word. And even the word for word is a little bit different, because when I put in my Greek, Mary was found to be pregnant, I even went word for word, but not literally. It was, and I've told you this, it was supposed to be, she was found to have in the womb or in her womb. And so you have to, when you start with that, you have to know, the translator has to know that's a Greek idiom that cannot make sense in English. So then, are you going to translate that word for word as best you can, or are you going to translate it as a thought? The thought is, she became pregnant. That's the thought of the idiom. If you want to do it literally word for word, then you're going to say she was found to have in the womb. But some word for word translations, they keep she was found and then say she was pregnant. But they use part of the idiom word for word, and then they bring in meaning, the thought of the idiom. So yeah, to answer your question, you have to start word for word, and then you go thought for thought. So there's a lot of work behind the actual translation when you actually see it. So we have word for word, thought for thought, and then there are a few translations out there that want to strike a balance. They want to do both. And the problem is that when we categorize things, okay, we have all these languages out there, and now we're going to put them into categories so we can understand them. And that's usually why we categorize things. You know, everything's unorganized, maybe it's a mess, and we want to pigeonhole them and categorize them so we can make sense of them. Well, when we do that, these are human-made categories that we come up with. Things don't always fit when we do that. Sometimes word for word translation may border or cross the line into a thought for thought translation. And then there are times when a thought for thought translation will border or cross over into a paraphrase. And then there are some times when the translations will move back and forth. Well, I thought this was a word for word translation, but it reads like a thought for thought translation. And I don't know, Glenn, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, on the handout, I had the New Jerusalem Bible as word for word, and the passage we were working with, you were saying, hey, this reads more like a thought for thought, and it did. So it's kind of hard to stick 100% or tightly in each category. And so there are a few translations, as I said, that will attempt to seek a balance in their translation. So the intention is not to be only a word for word or a thought for thought, but again, try to do both. So on your handout, I want you to read what I'll read it, but I want you to follow with me. What the Contemporary English Bible says in its preface. The CEB translators balance rigorous accuracy in the rendition of ancient texts. That's word for word. The CEB translators balance rigorous accuracy in the rendition of ancient texts with an equally passionate commitment to clarity of expression in the target language. Thought for thought. They're right there. They're telling you they're trying to do both.
Is that the Common English Bible?
Yeah, I don't have it here. It's on my
Oh,
desk.
that's Bibles.
Yeah, the Common English Bible. And our pastors use that among a variety of other Bibles. The Common English Bible is the translation for the Anabaptist. Yeah, the new Anabaptist Bible that came out recently. So, any questions about the balance? And you can imagine if you're trying to do both, you're going to come to a point when the only way to translate this, if you're doing both, might be word for word. There's not going to be a lot of room for thought. Then you might get into something that's a little bit more loose and ambiguous, and then a thought for thought translation is probably gonna be more helpful than a word for word. It's when it's ambiguous and we try to go word for word. It's get awkward and choppy, things of that nature. So what we're gonna do, let's remember, let's go over the Greek one more time, because we haven't met for 2 weeks. So the birth of Jesus Christ was in this way. That's how the Greek reads. 118 on page 3, is it? Yeah, page 3. Where it says Greek. So the birth of Jesus Christ was in this way, and you'll see how the different translations smooth that out. And then his mother Mary was engaged to Joseph, and we found some translations say that she was engaged to be married to Joseph. So they sneaked that in there. But those are more thought for thought translations that do that. But before they came together, and what does that mean? Then she was found to be pregnant from the Holy Spirit. That's pretty much a literal rendition of the Greek. But before they came together, she was found to have in the womb from the Holy Spirit, which means to be pregnant. Okay, now let's go to the contemporary English Bible. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ took place. Now that's a translation of the birth of Jesus Christ was in this way. So we don't really talk that way in English. The birth of somebody's grandson was in this way. We'll say, it was a hard pregnancy, it was a hard long birth, or it was a short birth. The baby popped out in 10 minutes. Please. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ took place. That's what how the contemporary English Bible translates the birth of Jesus Christ was in this way. Then his mother Mary was engaged to Joseph. When Mary, his mother, was engaged to Joseph, so that's pretty straightforward, before they were married. So this is kind of where the thought for thought comes in here. They're translating before they came together to say before they were married. And then the rest is basically word for word. She became pregnant by the Holy Spirit. She was bound to be pregnant by the Holy Spirit. And so a thought for thought translation there. They're going to leave that she was found out of there and just say she was pregnant. So they just take that whole idiom. She was found to have in the womb. They take that whole idiom and say she became pregnant. And so that's your balance. I would say it leans a bit more toward a word for word as opposed to a thought for thought. But these balanced translations are a little bit difficult to pull off. Although the more I work with the contemporary English Bible as I'm reading the Greek and Hebrew, and then I go to the contemporary English Bible, the more I'm beginning to like this translation. And because I'm seeing what they're doing. So again, it is important, whatever translation you're reading, to read the preface. See, what was the purpose? What's the purpose of this translation? What's the agenda of the translators? What are they trying to accomplish? The preface will tell you that. Okay, any questions? I don't think there'd be much discussion on the balance, because
This is kind of tangential, but it came up,
go ahead.
These are Bibles in common circulation here. There's other parts of the English world that are English speaking. And recently when I was, just a couple weeks ago, I was in Dominican Republic. And lots of times your choices for translations included English UK or English USA.
Yes.
So this New Jerusalem Bible tends to be British. If you're reading it, the spellings and word
Yeah.
usages are
Yeah.
British English. So
Understand.
do you have a sense of how widely used these translations we've been talking about are? And I mean, what translations are you not including that are contemporary translations in other Englishes?
Right, well, I'll be honest, I'm basically focusing on the translations that we're using here in the US or America.
Are there many others? Are there?
Joe, you might be helpful, you probably know more about this than I do.
The English church and organizations,
The Anglican Church,
the English relational bodies, and they sponsored the New English Bible about 1969, 1970. And it sold a little bit here in the US. I think you can go to the town library, find a copy of it there yet. But it never took off. That was my first other than King James Bible I got in 1970, somewhere in 1970. And it's very British idiom. It just wasn't popular because of the British spelling,
right,
the
well,
British slang that they were using. And because of that, the 90s, they came up with a replacement for the New English Bible, was Revised English Bible,
Yeah.
which is their current equivalent to the Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version, out of
Okay.
the British side
Sure.
of the ledger. So the REB would be the one you might find in Anglican churches today. Though they still like their old English style, going back to Kramer, really old things. But they also, so that'd be truly British, but they also have the New International Version with the British spellings you can get.
okay,
And
so
several
kind of a
others.
British edition
Right,
of
so,
the,
yeah, so you get the
international.
British, you can get the British edition of these things. Usually it's the spelling annoyances, like we don't like COLOUR.
Right,
And those kinds of things, so that's pretty
or,
easy to.
categorized with
Right,
a S as opposed to a Z.
Well, they just changed the spelling to conform to British spellings,
Sure.
and I think more than the New Revised Standard can do that. And the New Revised Standard has even been adjusted for Catholic sensibilities. And so you have the Catholic edition of the New Revised Standard Version that tweaks it to their theology and their preferences. So the publishers are accommodating the other traditions with the English language.
So they're available, but as you rightly pointed out, Glenn, and as I've said, I've been focusing more on the translations that we use here in the US. Hopefully, Joe's explanation helps with, at least some. I mean, I'm assuming there might be more translations in written or not, other than the.
The NEB and the REB are
Very much it.
the ones that really originated in the British tradition.
Well, why? I have a cousin, he and I grew up in the same town, and then he's a world-renowned economist. He worked for the British government. He was chief economist for the Department of Energy and Climate Change. He was also chief economist for Shell Oil, which is located in The Hague. So he he basically adopted British culture, so when we email back and forth, he has those different spellings. Like color, O-U-R. The Z or the S. So, kind of neat to see that. Anyway, okay. On to the paraphrase, page 4 on your handout. And I'll be working with the first part of the handout here. What is a paraphrase? It's what I've written here is a version of the Bible that attempts to convey in modern and everyday English the meaning of biblical verses and or passages. Then, okay, that's fine, and that could pass for a definition of a thought for thought translation, but it goes beyond a thought for thought translation and attempts to tell the reader what a particular passage means. After we read a word for word and a thought for thought translation, okay, we read it, like we might read 118 in Matthew, then we read the word for word or thought for thought translation, and then we might say, okay, what does that mean? That's what we have commentaries for. Go to the commentary and it'll tell you well, based on their theology and on how they interpret the Bible, they'll tell you what they think that particular verse or a particular passage means. But when we get into a paraphrase, sometimes there's an attempt in the translation. Well, I'm not going to call paraphrase a translation. There's an attempt in the version of the paraphrase to tell you in the paraphrase what it means. And so when that happens, you start the person writing the paraphrase begins to put in their theology begins to become a bit more transparent, because as you're trying to interpret a passage, you're going to start to interpret that from a theological framework. And we all have different theological frameworks. So that begins to sneak in, and then it becomes apparent as to what theological base this person is working from. So, whereas the author of a paraphrase will insert his or her meaning within the paraphrase. So, and that can happen in a thought for thought translation. Because there are times when a thought for thought translation, in my opinion, will delve into a paraphrase. So I'll be reading the Hebrew or Greek, and then I might consult like the New English, the New Living Translation. I say, they went into a paraphrase here. They kind of crossed the line, and it's kind of easy to do. As I said earlier, it's hard to keep only a word for word and a thought for thought. Sometimes a thought for thought translation will sneak into a paraphrase. So instead of a word for word translation or a thought for thought translation, a paraphrase tries to restate the biblical context verse for verse or passage by passage. So they'll look at the verse or the passage and they'll try to restate that, and sometimes go beyond this whole notion of thought.
And are they looking at the Greek and Hebrew, or are they looking at already?
Good question.
Translate.
That's a good question. What was Ken? Oh, sorry.
Your voice is going up. Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
You want me to repeat it? Or?
No, go ahead.
Linda is asking, are they working from the Greek and Hebrew? Because it's pretty evident that word for word and thought for thought translations are working from the original languages. Now, the big question with the paraphrase, are they? Now, I think Joe can help me on this. Kenneth Taylor was the one who wrote the Living Bible, and he was not working from the Greek and Hebrew. He was working from the American 1901 edition of the American Standard Version. ASV, American Standard Version. This is what Kenneth Taylor, and as I understand from Joe, his purpose wasn't to write a translation or he just wanted to write something, what, for his kids
For his
or
grandchildren.
for his grandchildren. And so then it turned into this living Bible. It took off. And as a pastor, I used to go into people's homes and they might not be the most committed in the church where I was pastor. And I'd go in the home and everything was cleaned up and there was this nice green living Bible right there on the coffee table. And so it went in that direction. Now, the question really is for the message. Eugene Peterson is the one who wrote the message. That's the paraphrase that our pastors use sometimes. The message. You're familiar with this, right? Yeah. And Peterson does have a background in Hebrew and Greek, and in his early years, he taught Hebrew and Greek. And so there are some people who defend and say he's working, and he even claims to be working from the Greek and the Hebrew. Number one, when you have one person doing a version or a translation, most translation efforts involve a number, a committee, and maybe a committee for each book. It's a very in-depth process. So I have spent some time with the message along with the Greek and the Hebrew, and I've come to the conclusion, I may be wrong, but it looks like he's really working with the New International Version more so than Hebrew and Greek. Now, having said that, I'm pretty sure there are times he does work with the Hebrew and Greek, but I don't think he's as fluent in it now or when he wrote the message than some of the people who are translating. Because, let's say someone has spent most of their career working on the Chronicler, like our dean at Bethany. He's an expert in First and Second Chronicles. So the editors of a translation, they're going to ask someone like that to translate First and Second Chronicles. And then they're going to ask someone who's spent their life researching and writing about the book and teaching about the book of Genesis. The experts in Genesis are going to be asked to translate Genesis. And so Matthews, you have Matthew scholars and Mark scholars. So we get, so that's different than when you have one person translating or writing, paraphrasing the whole Bible. So with Peterson, I think he was spread a little thin to do this all by himself. So I'm going to answer Linda's question this way. I think he's working with the Greek and Hebrew, but he's also working with with the translations he feels are important or the ones he likes the best, and he's working with them as well. Because there are times when I'm working with the message and then I'll say, this sounds familiar, and I'll go to another translation and it's almost verbatim. And that, for me, that's happened more with the NIV, the New International Version, than some others. So that's, but I remember Paul Mundy, he was preaching at our district conference, and he really made a plug that, because, some people like me are a little bit, I don't know if critical is the right word. I'm just trying to say it how it is, but he was getting a little defensive and say, well, hey, Peterson has knowledge of the Hebrew and Greek. I don't deny that, but it's whether or not you're gonna use that knowledge, and then how much of that knowledge does he have when he was a student? See, the reason I continue to read Hebrew and Greek at 66 years of age, because I don't wanna lose it. And you do lose it. And it's also, you may get this, you may not, but every time I read from the original language, it's a spiritual experience. It's kind of my devotions. John David and I, we've had conversations about that. It was the same way when.
Down through the years, I remember translations or paraphrases. Back in the 50s, J.B. Phillips was very popular.
Yeah.
Then the Good News Bible or today's English version. And then the Reader's Digest came out with a version one time. I don't think that came out very well.
No, I don't think so.
What were these based on?
Well, I'm not sure about J.B. Phillips. Maybe
On the Cotton Patch version was another one.
Phillips was a modern language emphasis. Not so much.
Modern language Bible.
It was using contemporary English.
Right. And the Good News Bible, which is now the Good News Translation, I'm gonna say, for me, it's been kind of a mix between a thought for thought and a paraphrase. Is there a time, I mean, I used to think it was thought for thought, but then the more I've worked with it, it obviously it takes a lot of latitude in that thought for thought, so then it does run into a paraphrase.
The Cotton Patch version was a top that went for a while too.
Yeah.
Well, you say
Just so the
that,
gospel-
Ray, just to read a paragraph, Clarence Jordan said, to be sure, this is a risky undertaking. For one thing, it simply can't be done with absolute accuracy. Matching present day people, groups and settings with the biblical counterparts involves a good bit of guesswork and subjective interpretation. Mingled with the best knowledge one has of both the modern and ancient situation. For example, I paired the Pharisees with church members and the scribes with theologians and seminary professors. This may pinch and may well be challenged. In fact, I gladly yield to those who may do a better job of, he uses matching instead of thought. He said you match these two.
George, is that Cotton Patch?
Yeah, this is what I used in the 70s.
I love it.
You're reading from the preface of
The forward.
Clarence Jordan, well, I don't have room up here. Clarence Jordan, the Cotton Patch Gospels, is that what it says? Oh, okay, this is just a version of Matthew and John, but isn't there a Cotton Patch?
Gospel.
Yeah, I think I have that on my shelf.
And there's a well-known recording of the creation. It shows you beautiful and that deep resonant voice of his.
And Clarence Jordan comes out of Jubilee, is that it? Koinonia, yeah, which is down in Georgia and might have some connections with Habitat for Humanity, but his take is to work with the Bible and come up with a paraphrase in this case that would be more sympathetic with the marginalized in society. So and it's out there.
The interesting thing in the paraphrase there, Joseph really says, I'm getting out of this situation. But then God intervened and he said, she's pregnant because of the Holy Spirit, not because of you.
Yeah.
And his name is Joe Davidson.
Yeah.
Oh, he calls him Joe Davidson instead of Joseph.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
yeah.
that's funny.
So that's an attempt to, so when you read the Cotton Patch, obviously you want to be familiar with with what the translation says, but then, you know, this, if you're into something like that, it could really bring it alive for you. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for cut and paste. So I don't want to be anti-paraphrase. Paraphrases are good. It's how you use them. I mean, if you're using a paraphrase in place of a translation, or if you think your paraphrase is a translation, then I'm saying, you know, that could be a little bit dangerous.
Is there a paraphrase Bible that you have like found to be like the most accurate?
That's tough because, you know, each paraphrase, they have an agenda more so than the translators do. And like the Cotton Patch version here, he calls Joseph, what was it, Joe Davidson or something like that? So, you know, the message probably is trying to be as most accurate to the Greek and Hebrew because Peterson does have a background in the biblical languages. And that, but we do have people who are working with paraphrases who don't really care much for the biblical languages or just aren't that school. They may have taken Greek or Hebrew once, but just because you took Greek or biblical Greek or Hebrew doesn't mean you. I mean, when I was in grad school, I read Hebrew 1 hour every night, and that every day I'd included holidays. So I would have the proficiency to pass the exam on the PhD level at Drew University. So that's how I got there. And now I'm taking that a little bit further now in my retirement. So you really have to know this stuff. And and I don't think the goal of a paraphrase is to be accurate. Not always.
I just looked up the preface of Eugene Peterson. And he talked of the message. He talks about study, you know, his intention was to be a scholar.
Mhm.
And he studied the languages, but then his life took a different path and he became a pastor.
Yeah.
And so he says, can I just read just a little bit?
Go ahead.
As we read, and he's talking about the Bible, we find that there is a connection between the word read and the word lived. Everything in this book is livable. For many of us, the important question that we ask as we read is not what does it mean, but how can we live it? So he's saying that I'm not gathering religious data by which we own our gods, but he wants you to, he says his goal is to make the Bible livable in this day and age for people. And this is interesting. At the bottom of his preface, he is the only, you know, scholar or interpreter, but he has exegetical consultants for the message. And these are people from a variety of universities that Old Testament and New Testament. So he did have input from many other scholars.
What is that word, the exegete, what is that?
Exegetical, it's exegesis.
Comes from the word exegesis, and it's really a
What to Jesus?
exegesis, as opposed to exemosis.
No,
I'm sorry.
I don't know what it means.
EX.
What does that mean?
Let him tell you. I mean, I know, but he's the teacher.
I thought he was saying exegesis. Is
There's
that?
eisegesis and exegesis.
It means to study and expand.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Exegesis as opposed to
I thought you were saying X and then like Jesus, like J-E.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
This is a soft G. Can you read my writing?
Yes.
I need to rewrite it. Yeah, this is a soft G. Exegesis, and it means out of. So you're trying to bring, you're reading the text. So exegesis, a simple word for that is interpretation. So you're reading a text and you're trying to pull a message out of the text. Where eisegesis is you read the text and then you force feed, and this is you force feed a message into the text. So, and we have a lot of people in this world who do eisegesis. They'll say, this text means this, and you read it, and it doesn't. So they've taken their theology and they've implanted it into their interpretation. So at seminary, eisegesis is a no-no. Don't do that. Exegesis, we would write, I think, in our class on Genesis, and it was a group of 4 of us. We did a very detailed exegetical papers, probably 50 pages long. Now, most pastors, when they're preparing a sermon, all of our 3 pastors I know, when they're preparing a sermon, they do exegesis.
The root, the Jesus, what is that? Do you know?
Not offhand.
Okay.
No, it's
Someone said back here behind me.
So is it just the study of, is that what that?
Glenn, what's okay.
Did Donna, did you say?
So, but Glenn, you said 2 words, expand and.
Study and
I
expand.
thought the.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if that's quite it.
Oh, yeah.
When I was teaching we're out of time, so I'll just say this, and then what we'll do next time is we'll come back and look at Matthew 1:18 to see what the message does with Matthew 1:18. And there are some, it's very interesting. I think if you have a chance, read it in the message. And I'm kind of fascinated what he does with that. And I think I know what he does with that. And he's trying to lead you in. It's a paraphrase, trying to explain something that'll make more sense when you get to the next verse. So he's doing something. And that'll be an interesting discussion. But the last thing I want to say about exegesis and interpreting the Bible, I remember talking to one of my students when I was teaching at St. Mary's Seminary and University when I was pastoring in Baltimore. And he said, well, when we preach, we try not to let our exegetical underwear hang out. So and me as a pastor, I know our pastors, they do a lot of work of interpreting the Bible, but they don't include all. Otherwise, it'd be a teaching session. So I can tell, how much exegesis they've done or not because of what I know and how I interpret the Bible. But you don't want to, just because something sounds nice, you don't include it in a sermon. And I learned that in grad school. One of my professors says, don't put anything in a paper or a sermon that doesn't advance your main thesis. And how many times have I heard a pastor share a story or a quote has nothing to do with the thesis? It sounds nice, it gets some laughter, but it's not there. It doesn't connect. So we have to be careful when we're doing these things, not to go out there. All right, next time, we'll finish off this handout and one English translation. Did I have another handout?
You can't put it in the Bible. If you're putting your exegesis in the Bible, then that's.
But I thought exegesis is trying to get the message out of the Bible.
Right, which is what we do here as a group, but if you're writing the Bible, it's that you're doing exegesis.
Interrupted, but I have an announcement.
Some people have left.
Yeah. Trying to catch everybody. I just wanted to remind you of the Lancaster Barnstormers
Listen up, everyone.
Thursday, May 22nd. There are 3 tickets at 11 o'clock in at noon time, 11 lunchtime. Lancaster Barnstormers, May 22nd at 11. The tickets are free. You just need to sign your name and how many tickets you want. You can bring friends. I need to collect this next week. because the host who's providing the tickets needs to pick them up. I did May 15th for Kentucky, so middleman's only here a short time, so think about it, ask your friends for May 22nd. If you're interested in Barnstormers, you can either sign here or call me.
Okay, thanks, Deb.
Middle of the